皆さん、こんにちは。登録上は77人いるので、もうちょい増えるかなと思いますけども、まあ、時間なので、スタートしましょう。Okay, so now we will start your talk. So like this international conference, sometimes we held like this seminar invited from the foreign researchers. そう。で、今日はドイツの先生が先週もトラウマの話をしていただいて、で、今週は通信っていうので、テーマがまた変わりますけども、海外で、どんなことを研究されているのかを、ぜひ皆さんと一緒に勉強したいと思います。で、ドイツで災害とか防災ってあんまり聞かないんですけど、でも、ドイツの先生に聞くと、最近は洪水があったりとか、いろいろして、災害対策も、重要なテーマの一つであるというふうに伺っています。で、ドイツにも、日本のように災害の研究センターがあるようなので、そこで、研究をされているということなので、ぜひ、いろんな話を聞いてみたいと思います。So we want to learn from the German case, and what is your research, and what is disaster management or countermeasures in German. Okay. Okay, じゃあ、はい。Please start.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much for having me. It's an honor. My name is Gordon Müller-Seitz. I'm from the University of Kaiserslautern Landau in Germany, and I would like to report about a 3-year case study where we worked together with the Fire and Emergency Services of Düsseldorf, which is a medium-sized town in Germany. It could be easily just a borough in Tokyo, but for Germany it's a city with 600,000 inhabitants. And we had the opportunity to closely work together with all staff, be it the head of the Fire and Emergency Services or the firefighters themselves. And the topic, as mentioned here, how reliability emerges on the network level, is to be interpreted against the backdrop of the question, what happens if a disaster strikes? Who is responsible for it and who acts upon it? And is it a single organization? Is it a ministry? Is it maybe in your case in Japan, the FDMA? So in Germany, just to spoil it a bit, it's not so easy to answer because in Germany we have a decentralized governmental system and actors need to spontaneously join forces in order to manage the respective crisis situation or disaster. And towards this end, as was mentioned, I try to report the results, how this unfolds. So I say a few words about my personal institution before I set the foundation why we conducted this study again. Say a few words about the lens, i.e. the perspective with which we look upon the case, and then I report upon where we did the research and how we did the research before I present the results and present some lessons learned for discussion. Now, as for my person, I work at the, as mentioned, University of Kaiserslautern Landau. It's a technical university, as we say in Germany, so not like a university of applied science, but a university with a technical focus. So we have a lot of engineers, computer scientists, and guys from mathematics. I'm myself from business administration, but have founded, among others, the Center for Interdisciplinary Disaster Research, where my colleague Matthias Roos was also presenting here. So I'm following his footsteps, so to speak. And we, as the name Center for Interdisciplinary Disaster Research suggests, we are interested in trying to look from the engineering sciences, from pedagogics, from business administration, try to better understand how to manage crisis situations or disasters. My take is always, of course, the management side, so how to govern different actors and how they can improve the situation. And apart from this, I also work together with the German Public Health Institute, the Robert Koch Institute, or the European Commission on how to deal with disasters. Now, as for the specific research project, now in terms of the motivation, why we studied or why we became interested in it, we identified, let's say, gap in managerial practice in real life that usually organizations try to optimize themselves. So at least in the German setting, the organizations are very well aware how to, especially the so-called high reliability organizations, who need to be reliable even under severe circumstances, like power plant companies, like defined emergency services, police, the military, and all these organizations are very well organized. Maybe not as good as in your country, but for German standards, they are good organized in terms of how to manage crises when it comes to organizing themselves. But in a crisis situation, if a disaster strikes, of course, different agencies have to collaborate together. And this is what is left out of the analysis usually. So to keep a long story short, we have a good understanding of how a single organization can optimize its operations, but how different actors from different organizations, like the police in Germany, not only the fire and emergency services, some local administrative authorities, the Red Cross, for instance, or we call it technical support network, Technisches Hilfswerk, an organization that also, for instance, if there's an earthquake, helps, at least in Europe, most of the time, helps these countries or these regions to come to terms with the evacuation. All these different organizations need to work together. And our research interest was to better understand what makes Düsseldorf a role model in the German context, because in the German context, a lot of our respondents, when we approached the field, mentioned that, well, Düsseldorf is a prime case for Germany. And we try to understand how they can collaborate on such a network level if there's no authority involved, because the fire and emergencies cannot tell the police what to do, or the military what to do, or the Technische Hilfswerk, or the Red Cross. So they somehow need to join forces. But this was our understanding, how can, or our interest, how can these organizations join forces and collaborate highly reliable, similar to optimizing one's own organization in a single case. How can they manage and ensure that they highly reliably work on the network level of analysis? And as mentioned, in the case of networks, the challenge is usually that the partners are most of the time equal, and especially if there are a lot of partners, it becomes difficult to motivate them to work together, because each and every organization has its own standard operating procedures. Each and every organization has its own informal guidelines or informal ways of dealing with crises, its own informal, sometimes hierarchy, and bringing this together in the case of an emergency or a crisis or disaster situation is quite challenging. Nonetheless, these organizations need to work together in the form of a network, even if it's only in a temporary fashion, so just for the specific incident. And when I speak of a network, I relate to 3 or more organizations, which makes it tricky. And to already forecast that, a lot of the problems that arise from the frictions of different emergency plans, different standard operating procedures, etc., are usually solved by informal interactions between the different organizations. But more on that when it comes to the results. Now, a few words about what makes up high reliability organizations. This is a debate in the social sciences, stemming or actually relating back to Charles Perrow, who was on the research commission of the near nuclear incident at 3 Mile Island in New York City, or near New York City. And he came up with this so-called normal accident theory, suggesting that because large-scale organizations that need to be highly reliable, such as power plant operators, they suffer, or they face two challenges, let's put it this way. First, the operations are tightly coupled, the technical ones and the human ones, so the human technical assemblage, the system. And it's also, apart from being tightly coupled, it's quite complex. And this combination makes it very prone or very likely that failures will occur. And towards this end, he says it's normal, hence this theory, normal accident theory, that accidents will happen. It's just a question of time. And this is a normative and rather pessimistic stance. And the research on high reliability organizations picks up this line of reasoning, but turns it the other way around and argues, well, if it was so dangerous, it's surprising that so few catastrophes happen with power plants, with aircraft carriers, and other of these high reliability organizations. And the research in this line came up with the conclusion that there are 5 principles to be obeyed of high reliability organizations in order to manage these very organizations and their critical infrastructures or whatever they deal with. And the first principle is preoccupation with failure. So they are really keen on learning from failures. So for instance, where as oftentimes people try to shy away from pointing at deficiencies, there the staff is really encouraged to really deal with the failures and to try to understand them in detail and not come up with a attitude that we know everything, but that you are really encouraged to dig very deep into each and every failure in order to properly understand the phenomenon. Second principle is reluctance to simplify operations. Here, and closely related to the first principle, the idea is that the organizations should not try to argue, well, we have seen this problem already, and this is the reason why we already know the solution. So you really try to take a step back and try to analyze everything as neutral as possible and as uninformed as possible. So you also try to unlearn, in other words, and try to be naive in a positive sense, that you try to approach each and every new failure or near miss with a certain curiosity or naivety, instead of saying, well, we had a similar problem, I know the solution, and let's do it this way. So this is entirely different in this case. Third principle, sensitivity to operations. This means that the hierarchy, and this is closely related to the fifth principle here, deference to expertise. The hierarchy is not as important as the persons that are working or that are having the actual problem. So for instance, in the case of nuclear power plant, it's not the management that is decisive or the boss of the respective power plant, but it's those persons where the problem occurs on site, and they are deemed being the most important persons so as to come to terms with the tricky situation. And fourth principle, a commitment to resilience, just implies that they train in advance and to also deal with unforeseen issues. These kinds of organizations, sometimes even with unrealistic scenarios. So for instance, I know I've been exposed because I lived in the United States for a few months a year ago, that I learned that the Navy SEALs, for instance, train their organization or their staff with an alien invasion. So of course it's entirely unrealistic, but the idea is how to manage the unforeseen, how to deal with the unforeseeable, and to enhance the, let's say, cognitive flexibility of the staff. And then they try to learn, of course, after an incident from these very incidents as mentioned, so as to make it not happen again in any case. And having said that, so these principles very well work on the organizational level, and the question is now, how does it work on the network level if, owing in light of the previous slide, in networks, you don't have a hierarchy because, of course, some network partners might be more relevant than others. Like the fire and emergency services are certainly more powerful than the other partners, but it becomes ever more challenging. So it's not like in a, let's say, Japanese keiretsu, where you have Toyota on top of the organization and then you have the different suppliers. So there's no such clear hierarchy in these networks, usually, at least in the German setting. And theoretical-wise, we took a look at the actual practices. So we are interested in what do the fire and emergency service personnel actually do when the fire breaks out. And in light of this, we were also interested in the risks and uncertainties that they are facing. So, for instance, a risk is something which you can calculate, like throwing a dice, and the outcome is 1 to 6 if you have an ordinary dice with 1 to 6 as an outcome. And along similar lines, of course, if there's carnival, you can expect problems. So you plan for the carnival in Düsseldorf, in the city where we did our research. However, there are also unforeseen incidents. So, for instance, there was a potential bomb found at the airport, and this was, of course, unforeseen. And suddenly, the whole airport had to be evacuated, or there was a chemical leak at a company which is resided in Düsseldorf, and suddenly different actors had to come to terms with the situation because the leak was not to be managed or couldn't be managed anymore by the fire and emergency services from the chemical company, and so they needed help from other organizations, and then it became tricky. And that's what uncertainty is about. So uncertainty in its extreme form cannot be foreseen. So they deal with risks, things that you can foresee and calculate, and unforeseeable things, i.e. uncertainty. And we were interested not only in the technological risks, but also, as mentioned, in the governance issues. So how do these companies or organizations collaborate? As mentioned, in terms of the research setting, we took a look at the fire and emergency services of Düsseldorf, Germany. As pointed out, it's like a borough in Tokyo, so very small for your standards here, but a medium-sized city for German standards with 600,000 people, roughly. And the fire and emergency services in Germany are quite similar to Japan insofar as they also deal with all kinds of accidents. So it's not like in the United States where the firefighters are just fighting fire, hence the name, but they are also responsible for less critical incidents like the cat that is on the top of the, of the tree, and the owner wants to have the cat back, up until a chemical leak, as mentioned, a bomb that was being found at the airport, or whatever kind of other disaster might strike, or planned organizational venues such as a soccer game. There the fire and emergency services are also leading the activities or collaborating with the other organizations to manage the soccer game, or imagine a, Yomiuri Giants game tonight. So this is the broad range of activities where the fire and emergency services are being involved. And they collaborate, depending upon the specific setting or the severity of the incident, with about or up to 60 other organizations. What we did in terms of trying to understand the phenomenon was conducting interviews, 55 formal ones, 53 informal ones, with all kinds of participants, not only the fire and emergency services. For over 500 hours, we engaged on site. So we ran around in fire and emergency suits, department suits, and did a lot of engaged with the fire and emergency department in a lot of trainings, but also actual incidents. And we also screened a lot of data and got all kinds of information that we were interested in. We were made available these information. And then we analyzed it. I'm skipping that because just in case you're interested, I could say a few words about it, but I'll focus now upon the results. So the first result was that reliability is actually residing within the informal relations across actors. So for instance, we found out, and it might sound quite mundane, almost ridiculous, that to you, but it was decisive for our specific setting, that in Germany usually you address one another by the surname. And these guys, at least in these more or less bureaucratic settings, often this is the case. And they were all on first person terms with one another. So they addressed each other by the first name, which is highly uncommon in the German, let's say, emergency setting. And again, this might sound a bit ridiculous, but it fostered the, let's say, trust across participants. And it helped to build up ties across the different organizations. So they, for instance, also had informal or formal meetings, but afterwards they had informal get-togethers. What sounds, of course, in an academic setting normal is there highly unusual. And it helped to establish trust between the different actors and to establish different, at times in a positive sense, redundant communication channels also between the different actors. And what we observed was that in times of crisis, let's say when the bomb was found at the airport, it really helped because if there weren't these informal ties, people would have to, let's say, for the sake of argument, search for the telephone number in some kind of directory. And then the person might have been ill at the other side, at the other organization, or currently on vacation, or I don't know, the number might have been outdated. But in our setting, since they were also connected by means of the mobile phones or social media, to be more precise, they could easily get in touch with one another and bypass those minor problems, which usually would occur if you are very distanced with one another. And this helped because these dormant ties that were built up during times of when there was no crisis and no incident to be served proved to be quite valuable at the end of the day. So in other words, stability needs to be built up in non-crisis times in order to work in crisis times, and hence also the reliability. Now, as for the informal coordination I just stressed, they really repeatedly also mentioned that they have all kinds of plans for each and every organization. So for instance, the Find Emergency Services have an 800-page document how they manage each and every kind of situation. But they ironically said, well, these are some kinds of fantasy documents, which maybe we need afterwards in order to justify certain actions, or if there's a legal case where someone sues someone else, or one organization is sued by a person or organization that is being heard, then we use it and maybe also rely upon it in order to justify ourselves. But we, instead of sticking to these predefined rules, we try to build a joint understanding and, for instance, this will be also mentioned on another result slide here, we build up a joint understanding in terms of sharing maps. So for instance, for the old town of Düsseldorf, the police has or in former times had a map. And they had different stations where, in the case of an emergency, they which kind of positions they will go to in the case of an emergency. The same held true for the Find Emergency Service, the same held true for the Red Cross, and so on and so forth. And then they realized, once they aligned these maps and sat together in a room and discussed the different maps, that in the case of a severe emergency, let's say like a mass panic during Carnival, they would have had problems not only because of the mass panic, but also because they would have planned with the same positions where their emergency cars could go to, be it from the Find Emergency Services, be it from the police, be it from the Red Cross, etc. And so by means of aligning these different coordination artifacts, or in this case maps, to a single map, which each and every organization uses, there would be at least no, let's say, difficulties to go to the right positions because they wouldn't block themselves, which happened at times in the case of minor instances before, which is why they sat together and tried to figure out how they can solve the situation and came up with this joint map. And towards this end, they also engaged in exchanges between personnel. So sometimes, like an intern, persons from the police went to the fire and emergency department for a while and vice versa in order to learn from the other organization and to comprehend how does this organization work, especially informally, when something happens. And this knowledge, this informal knowledge exchange helped also, of course, to know at the end of the day, if there's an emergency, whom do I have to call from in the other organization to get immediately a solution. So informality, again, is quite important here and enhances adaptability, as mentioned here. Yet another finding which we found intriguing is that redundancy, which is oftentimes deemed being negative because it's slack, something you do not need, was highly needed, or at the end of the day, valuable, because again, if someone is ill, if someone is on vacation, oftentimes critical, especially informal knowledge, is being lost in the organization. And thus, it really helps or helped the fire and emergency service, police, etc., in their joint operations if they had slack and they were overstaffed, so to speak, and also joint exercises. So there were numerous exercises where the different organizations worked together, and this helped in the case of, for instance, when a technology broke down or when something didn't work as planned ex ante, then this turned out to be helpful. So as a lessons learned here with the arrow at the bottom, it was deemed very helpful also as an argument towards the administration or the politicians to argue that, well, we need this redundancy in order to be reliable, because if we would manage it very, very efficiently, like let's say in the management field, in the case of, let's say, Toyota, like a just-in-time system, and everything is very neatly managed and there is no slack, then we would have a problem, because it is expected of us as the fire and emergency department or the police that we run smoothly and ensure safety for everyone being involved in the crisis situation. Next point is the shared sense making. So as mentioned, in the course of working groups, so for instance, there was a so-called Arbeitskreis Großveranstaltung, which means in English something along the lines of working group for large-scale events. They frequently sat together and planned each and every event up front. So while usually, or in most cases, maybe only the fire and emergency services, the police, and the organization that host the venue would have been the relevant actors. So think about the Yomiuri Giants game tonight. It would be the Tokyo Dome organization. It would be maybe the fire and emergency services, the staff that is working at the gates, and the police. But in this case, they came together with additional organizations, such as the in your case, the JR lines or the subway providers that bring people to the venue and from the venue, and other organizations being involved, so as to plan what happens if there's a, let's say, panic, how can we transport persons as soon as possible from the evacuate them as soon as possible, and of course in those cases then the public transportation providers also become relevant. So it was, in other words, always more people in the room or in the trainings or in the management of a single game, let's say soccer game in this case, most of the time in a German setting, there were more actors present than you might think of as first, but it helped to avoid risky situations. And they also established different, what's meant here with common vocabulary for risk scenarios, similar to these joint maps. They also had different code words for different kinds of incidents, but which they shared across organizations. So this joint vocabulary or common vocabulary also helped to properly communicate and deal with the situation across the different actors and proved to be very helpful. And in exercises, they also, again, try to share their experiences. And it was also the case that, let's say for the case of a soccer game, or imagine again a baseball game tonight, the police had always at least 2 or 3 persons on site, walking in 3 with 3 fire and emergency service personnel and other personnel. So for instance, from Tokyo Dome, on the side, so each 3 small teams staffed with 1 person from the fire emergency service, from the police, let's say Tokyo Dome, etc. And they walked around on site so as to have a joint interpretation. And if something went wrong, or if not even if something went wrong, but if someone had a bad feeling about a certain situation, let's say the police guy said, well, I feel we have a problem here for whatever kind of reason, then they try to discuss it on site and immediately inform all the organizations. And that's why it was deemed being quite valuable that they walked together through the venue while the respective game was taking place. And of course, they also had learnings after each and every incident or game. They tried to learn from the past in terms of what went well, what went wrong after each and every game, because usually at each and every game, something on a minor scale goes wrong. So that's why they try to learn from it. And as mentioned, in Germany, we have the peculiarity, or at least the feature that which oftentimes turns into a problem, that our bodies governing a city are decentralized, and then you have the federal level above, and this decentralization, I think, for instance, in contrast to the FDMA in Japan, if I'm correctly informed, makes it at times difficult to steer during a crisis, because there is not one person that has the authority to direct all kinds of operations. So for instance, in France, in an extreme case, in France, the French president has the say for everything. So starting from using atomic weapons to, he can even go into each and every commune in a small village and issue a directive, at least in theory. And in a crisis, this is deemed being quite helpful, but we found that this is impossible in a German setting due to the fragmentation of competencies. So it's quite, locally embedded, or in other words, the fire and emergency services of Düsseldorf are the highest authority in terms of dealing with crisis on the in the case of Düsseldorf. So, but they cannot deal beyond the boundaries of Düsseldorf with an incident, which makes it oftentimes hard, because we have a lot of volunteers in terms of firefighting. I think similar to Japan, in villages, it's not a job, a full-time job, but it are volunteers that are doing the fire and emergency work, and they have no authority to direct them what they shall do or not. But nonetheless, if you have the aforementioned redundancy and the interlapping connections between organizations, it usually paid off, and we could observe that this decentralization helped in many instances where it was deemed being better when being compared to a situation where would have been a central authority, or in other countries, because, for instance, we did a comparative study between Germany and the US, New York City, and there everything is centralized, and we realized that the German way of working, at least in this point, was deemed being more efficient at the end of the day, despite the problems of decentralization. Now, what are the lessons learned? First of all, we suggest that reliability needs to or can be managed also on the network level, but relies upon the collaboration across the different partners, especially in non-crisis times. So it needs a continuous engagement of all actors to practice in exercises, to join a meeting like the working group on large-scale events, which I mentioned, so as to ensure that even in a crisis, when a crisis strikes, everything runs smoothly. So that why it really helps if not only the most important actors are sitting together in a room and discuss the upcoming event, but also, again, as mentioned, think about the local transportation authorities, for public transportation authorities, which are also being involved in each and every event which relates to, let's say, a soccer game. So that also over the course of time, it helped because trust was being established across the different actors and helped to make the whole network more reliable and efficient at the end of the day. And the success, at least in the case of Düsseldorf, at least for the German setting, documents it very well. What is more, as a second lessons learned, we realized that the coordination interfaces are critical. So the interfaces between the different organizations, and as mentioned before, addressing, although it's simple and mundane, addressing each other on the first terms names helps. Trying to build up redundancy there, trying to have internships so that one person of the police works for let's say a week once in a while at the Fire and Emergency Department and vice versa, helps to smoothen the relationships between the different organizations. And this was deemed being very valuable in the case of crises. And also it helped to join forces as critical research, critical organizations vis-a-vis the political side. So as a lessons learned, the police had a benefit when they joined forces with the fire and emergency services and other actors when they wanted something from the municipal administration, so from the head of Düsseldorf, if you like, and this was by far better compared to a situation if the chief of the fire and emergency services went to the mayor of Düsseldorf, and separately the police and head of the police went to the mayor of Düsseldorf, and let's say the Technische Hilfswerk head went to the mayor of Düsseldorf for all their different kinds of wishes that they have from the politician, from the mayor. So it really paid off when they jointly when they joined forces and went to the mayor, because it had more impact at the end of the day. And what also became or proved to be valuable was that joint understanding of the crisis situation, starting from having joint maps to persons walking around at the events in small teams consisting of fire and emergency personnel, police department personnel, and other personnel, so as to be on site and immediately represent different kinds of organizations, so as to have a joint understanding of what happens on site and then distribute it to their organizations. And also have exercises, of course, and joint lessons learned afterwards sessions in order to better understand what was happening, how can we improve it the next time. So these repeated interactions of the different actors also was deemed being quite beneficial. And has also pointed out the redundancy, although not really invited by politicians, in this case the mayor, because he has to pay for it. It also served to be quite beneficial to not understaff or just exactly staff the police, firefighters, etc., as with a, let's say, limit of resources, so as to be able to operate, but to give them more rooms for maneuvering, financial wise. So, for instance, again, a small anecdote, the Find Emergency Services in Düsseldorf now can decide on their own. Again, it sounds a bit funny maybe, but they can decide on their own which kind of fleet they are ordering. And they are standardizing now the fleet in terms of most of the trucks in order to save money. And this money is then rechanneled into other activities which they deem being more important. This sounds like a very small and funny step, but it really helps the organization to maneuver more flexibly their financial resources, and at the end of the day also helps to be more efficient in terms of managing crises. And what is still a challenge, but where we found, let's say, where we also helped to find emergency services, is the question of how can they actually work together and manage the interfaces. And we encourage them in many ways. So some of the aforementioned insights are also due to our help. So as to be better prepared for crisis situations. So as mentioned, these joint trainings or simulations were important. These after action reviews. So when something happened, even if it was running smoothly, there's always something which can be improved after a carnival or after a soccer game, for the sake of argument, and or after the bomb found at the where a lot of things went wrong actually at the airport of Düsseldorf. It was contained and it was fine at the end of the day, because it turned out that it's actually no bomb, but everyone first thought it was a bomb because the video cameras suggested that the person really behaved suspiciously, and they learned also from the failures how they behaved in this instance a lot by frequently meeting and trying to improve the situation. So long story short, 3 ideas to be taken away. So reliability can be managed on the level of the network by means of as mentioned, trainings, etc. So in non-crisis times, they need to work together in order to make it more smoothly in the case of crises. They need to be as honest and as transparent about what goes wrong, and they need to build up collective redundancy in order to become resilient as a network. And it's not only about, as we call it in the management field, at least risk governance. So it's not only about anticipating what's going to happen and how likely, that's what most of the literature, at least in the management field, is about, calculating how likely is the event XYZ. And here it's more about establishing, or that's our suggestion, establishing reliability on the network level of analysis. So, and building thereupon, also together with my colleagues like Matthias Roos, Anja Dana Schröder, and others, as mentioned, we are a consortium of engineers and others being involved in the research interest on catastrophes and disasters. We try to better still understand how organizations can work together in crisis situations, especially how to govern the different institutions, because so far I only talked about the city of Düsseldorf, but imagine if something happens in the suburban or the environment that does not belong to Düsseldorf. Then, as mentioned, the Find Emergency Services have no power, no hierarchical say in terms of influencing others to do what they think is right. They can do it only to a certain extent in the city realm of Düsseldorf. And we try to explore how to work together with these other organizations, especially also volunteering organizations. So imagine there's a large-scale disaster happening in a city like Düsseldorf. Current research interest where also Matthias Roos is involved is, for instance, to think about how to deal with, let's say, local soccer clubs, because a local soccer club has a pitch, and the pitch can be reused for emergency situations so that a helicopter can land there and, I don't know, pick up persons that have been injured and send them to the hospital or so. So to use these, let's say, also civil resources like a soccer pitch when there's an organization behind it, but oftentimes informally driven only, and how these public actors or informal actors, let's put it this way, stakeholders, can be used to ensure reliability. And we also try to measure it and understand how this works in other settings, other nations. As mentioned, we compared it, the situation, among others, with the situation of the fire and emergency services in New York City so far. That's it. Thank you very much. Gosaicho arigato gozaimashita, if I pronounce it correctly. Gogiron o tanoshimi nishite orimasu. Thank you very much.